This video is presented by newwoodworker.com.
So you got your new table saw, and now you're all in a big hurry to get it from this to this and have it happen in just a couple hours. Well, not so fast there, Woody. If you get in a hurry putting a table saw together, that's about the best way I know of to really this thing up. If you don't take your time putting this saw together, you can lessen its performance or even make it dangerous. You want to do some alignments along the way when they're easier to do. One of the first things I'm going to do is put this saw in a mobile base. If you know you're going to use a mobile base, put the saw in it as soon as you can. Everything we do from this point on makes the saw heavier and harder to handle.
Usually there's either 2 or 4 bolts holding the machine to the pallet. If you're like me, right now you're wondering how they got these things in there in the first place. I keep one big box like this and put all of the trash in there and keep it until the saw is up and running and I'm sure I'm not missing anything. This saw is way too heavy for me to start horsing it around, so I use my shop crane to get it off of the pallet. These lifting straps may look small, but they're capable of lifting most of the truck that brought this saw. I've learned that to lift a saw like this safely, you don't want to do anything suddenly. I also lift it only as high as I need to get it off of the pallet or into the mobile base. This is a 2-ton shop crane from Jet, and it lets me move the saw to the safest place in the shop to work on it. And the whole time that it's in the air, nothing goes underneath this saw except the floor and eventually the mobile base. After measuring the length and width at the bottom of the cabinet, I can set the mobile base up so we can just set this cabinet right in it. I'm using a Jet heavy-duty mobile base, and it's all tool-free. I like these bases because they're very strong and very easy to work with. And now with the adjusted base beneath the saw, I can gently set it in. It fits nice and nobody got squished. You notice I have the fixed wheels on what will be the shorter end of the saw. The extension table for the fence will go on the other side of the saw, and with the casters on that end, this saw is just easier to drive around the shop when you need to move it. Jet uses this block of foam to support the motor during transport. To get it out, we just raise the blade all the way, that lifts the motor up, and we can pull the block of foam out. This is the shaft for the bevel handle, and you can see that the key is taped into the shaft. We have to take that tape off. Then we just slide the hand wheel on, tighten up the set screw, and then install the center lock. This is the only hand wheel I had to install. On some machines you have to install 2 of them. Next we want to clean the gunk off of the table surface so we don't get that all over everything. Some manuals still tell you to use kerosene to take this gunk off. I just go over it a couple of times with some simple grease and paper towels, and that works well. Remember to clean the miter slots out also, or they'll attract sawdust like you wouldn't believe. After cleaning the top, I give it a couple of coats of Bull Shields T9 to protect it. We've got a lot of work to do around this table, so we want to protect it from rust. I just spray a bunch of the T9 on there and rub it around with a paper towel. Cabinet saws like this one usually have 1 bolt in each corner that actually connects the top to the cabinet. This is a very easy system to get your blade perfectly aligned with the miter slots, and we're going to show you how to do that. I'm using my saw gauge for woodpeckers on a master plate for master gauge. I zeroed it out, move it to the other end, and I can see that my saw is about 3/1000ths of an inch out of parallel. I went around all 4 corners and loosened those Allen bolts up just a little bit. I don't want this table real free on top of the cabinet. Now I'm going to show you the entire process of taking this saw from about 3/1000ths out to just about nothing out. Each time I move the dial indicator to the end of the plate, I tap on that corner of the table until the dial indicator goes back to just before 0. I always leave it a little bit before 0. Then I move the indicator to the other end of the plate and tap that side of the table. After going back and forth a couple of times and taking my time, the needle hardly moves at all when I move it back across the plate. Now the needle moves less than the width of one of the lines on the dial indicator scale. Now I go around all 4 corners and snug the bolts down and check the dial indicator to be sure that the table hasn't moved. Then I go around and tighten the bolts up firmly and go back and check one more time and make sure that nothing has moved, and the dial indicator tells me that everything's fine. Next I want to use a good straight edge to make sure that the splitter plate is centered behind the blade. I lay the straight edge on both sides of the blade, making sure that it's not hitting any teeth, and it looks fine. The splitter's centered behind the blade. Next I use the multi-gauge from one way, another dial indicator, to set my throat insert. I want this so it's about 1/1000th below the surface. You just want to be sure that the boards can't catch on its edge when you move them across the saw. Next, we'll install the cast iron wings, but to start with, we have to make sure that the mating flanges here are absolutely clean. These wings weigh around 40 pounds apiece and are kind of awkward, so this is best done by 2 people. But I found that by standing up on end, I can get the first bolt started. And we have to make sure we run that bolt in so that it's fully engaged. And then I can start the bolt at the other end of the wing. Then I'll install a center bolt and draw all 3 of them down until they just hold the wing against the table. I use my multi-gauge from one way for setting these tables up. With all 3 bolts snugged up just a little bit, I can use my dead blow mallet to wrap on the wing to adjust its position. Sometimes it takes a little back and forth, but eventually I can get these so perfect that you can't really see a difference on the dial indicator. With both wings flush with the table surface, I use my long straight edge to make sure that the entire assembly is flat. If we hadn't have cleaned the flanges earlier, this is where we'll find out that a bit of sawdust or something was holding the end of a wing up. With all the hands-on work installing these wings, this is a good time to apply another coat of Bullshield T9 just to make sure we got the surfaces protected. Now we can begin installing the fence system, starting with the front rail. The front rail has to be a specific distance below the table saw's surface. That locates the main tube properly so it holds the fence arm flat on the table. Like the table saw wings, I install the fasteners and tighten them up just enough that I can use my mallet to bump this angle up and down to get it set. The manual specifies that the top of this rail should be 9/16 inch below the table surface. Here again, I go through a little of the up and down process, but eventually I can get this perfect, and that's important to how the saw is going to operate. After tightening all of the fasteners, I go back with the combination square and just make sure that the rail is not moved. On most fence systems, the back rail has no specific setting. I just make sure that it's level with the table surface. Next, we install the table between the fence rails. We put this table in now because we have to have access to the front rail for drilling holes and installing fasteners that hold it in place. My long straight edge helps me make sure that this extension table is flush with the saw's surface. Then we can drill the holes and install the fasteners that hold the table in place. The C-clamps are just holding the table to the rail so I can get it adjusted and install the fasteners. Now we can install the main tube on the front rail. Be sure to read through the instructions first, because on some saws, one of the screws on this end of the saw can help mount the switch. Before tightening the fasteners, I pull this tube forward towards me to make sure there's enough of a gap behind it for the fence to slide smoothly. Now we can check the fence itself to be sure that its faces are square to the table surface. If an adjustment is necessary, we use these screws in the top of the fence guide rail. Next, I use my woodpecker saw gauge again to see how close to parallel the fence face is to the miter slots. I like my fence to tail away from the blade at the back end by 1 to 3 thousandths, and this fence is right on the money. If we need to make a correction, we use these screws on the front of the T-square. These adjustments are generally very small. It's important to turn these screws equally with one in and one out. If we have everything on the fence adjusted right, these faces are just above the surface, and the only point of the fence that's actually in contact with the table is this pad at the rear. Most saws have adjustable stops for 0 and 45 degrees of bevel angle. With the new saw, I adjust both of those stops so they go beyond what they're supposed to do. That's because I know I'm going to check the setting with my squares anyway, so I just set it with my squares and don't worry with them bevel stops. This is a good time to install the guard assembly. So here I'm installing the splitter plate and lock that in place. Install the throat plate over the splitter. Snap the anti-kickback pawl assembly in place. And then the blade guard assembly itself. You'll notice that all of this is tool free, so there's virtually no excuse for not using them. This Jet X-Acto saw has a very good guard system, and that's a big reason I like this saw. And there you have it. My new Jet Deluxe X-Acto saw is all put together, tuned up, and ready to go. When assembling your table saw, make sure you read through the directions completely to make sure there aren't other things you have to do for that specific model. Before I put it away for today, I'm going to make a couple of test cuts to see how it does. I mainly want to see that the blade isn't slowing down. That would tell me I've got a loose belt, and that the cut is nice and clean, so I know that I have everything lined up right. I forgot to get a new blade when I got the machine, so this is an old one. But this is a 3 horsepower machine, so it's not real worried about an older blade. And this is the edge I just cut. Even with an older blade, the edge is nice and smooth because we took the time to line the saw properly.